early November, it's just one of those things where I've spent a lot of time with a lot of people, right? And so I've probably been, in the first 10 days of the month, last 10 days, probably been with 1,000 pastors, which for some of you, you're like, that would be torture. Actually, I like pastors, and we enjoy time together. And so I was in Atlanta with some people, I was in St. Louis, and then Thursday, you ready for this? I was in Herrin, Illinois. Anybody? Yeah, me neither, right? Yeah? Come on, really? So I had to be down near St. Louis, and going to give a talk one evening, and my hair was like, it was a bad hair day. And so I was overdue a couple weeks on a haircut. So I asked my pastor friend down there, I said, hey, so what's the best barber in Herrin? He said, well, it's a pretty limited choice, so why don't you talk to Drew over on Cherry Street? I'm like, okay. And we drove to downtown, sat in the chair, and got in. He said, hey, first of all, there's nobody else in this whole barbershop. I let my wife know, hey, honey, this is where I'm going to be, just in case. And I walk in, he's like, hey, did you call? I'm like, yeah, clearly I'm the only one here. And this was Drew. He had me sit down in the barber chair, and we began going to town, shaping up my hair. He said, what do you do? I said, well, I pastor a church. He said, oh, and that began an interesting conversation. Drew grew up in the church. Drew left his early adult years, went to Southwest Missouri, and in his own words, had some dark days. It was substance abuse. It was a really painful relationship with a woman who was not a good influence on him. And he found himself really far away. He found himself having some pretty dark thoughts. And I said, well, how did you end up back here in Herrin? He said, well, my brother owns this barber shop. In fact, that chair right there, and he pointed to the chair next one over. He said, and my brother, he's the OG, man. He is a great barber. And he invited me to come back, and he had me sit in this chair, and he trained me a couple of years ago to be able to do a barbering and that. But he said, Scott, my brother's also a pastor. Part-time barber, part-time pastor, or full-time barber, part-time pastor. I said, great. So he's helping improve people both spiritually and with their hair, right? And he said, yeah. And he said, Scott, listen, man, I came back. He's invested in me. And I see barbering. Listen to this statement. I see barbering as my ministry. I thought, here's a guy who's had a dramatic 180 turnaround and has gone from what he himself described as a very dark place in his life to wielding a straight razor and clippers as ministry. What happened was his brother invested in him, went after him. And even in a time of isolation and loneliness and feeling far from God, he brought him back. My question for you, who is your Drew? Over the next 4 weeks in this series, we're going to be in the book of Genesis. Now, today we're going to start in Hebrews chapter 11, where Abraham is looked back at as a hero of the faith. Who's your Drew? I said I spent a lot of time with pastors recently. And I've probably had 50 conversations, 20 of which got pretty honest pretty quick. If it was more than 5 minutes, we got to some pretty honest places. Listen. Here's what people are wrestling with today. I feel like I've been betrayed. I feel like, listen, does it really matter? That's a heavy load. I feel like I really don't know that I'm able to do the thing that I love to do. And I feel like I just have the same conversation with them. I'll say, do not quit. What you do matters. Do not let in the darkness, or do not doubt in the darkness what God has promised you in the light. Here's the reality of the age in which we live. A lot of people are quitting on their faith. The popular word is deconstructing. The Bible word is apostasy. There are people you know who grew up going to church, had those warm memories about what God has done in them, and maybe coming to church with mom and dad, and they've wondered if it's worth it. And some of them have walked away. And what they've discovered is it's worse away. Who's your Drew? There are some marks of a bored faith. By that I mean a faith that might be in danger of being thrown overboard. Pastor Austin, who is over preaching at Carroll Stream today to give Pastor Tay and his wife Samantha a bit of a break. And Pastor Austin and I talked about this during the week. And for a young man, Austin is just so insightful. Here's what he and I talked about. Here are symptoms of a bored faith. See if some of these don't resonate with you or somebody you love. Symptoms of a bored faith: life feels stuck in a rut. My knowledge has outpaced my obedience. That is, we may be the people that know all the Sunday school stories, know the right thing to do, but we're just not acting on that. And it brings us to a place of boredom or frustration, or the dissonance of, I know this, but I'm not doing this, and there's a gap there. And symptoms of a bored faith: life feels stuck in a rut. My knowledge has outpaced my obedience. How about this? My life feels like there's no point. That's just so heavy. Fourth, symptoms of a bored faith: my life feels like a failure. Maybe if I can encapsulate the conversations I've had with folks, it's that. You can love the Lord or do your best at your job and still at times deeply feel like you have not accomplished or done the things you want to do, or you're not the person you wanted to be. There's a deep sense of failure. It was last night at a wedding, and a man I've known for a long, long time, and one of the sharpest guys I know, young man, so bursting with potential. He came to me in a moment of kind of honesty. He's like, hey man, honestly, this has been like the really hardest season for me, maybe ever. It's tough. And because I know him well, I put a finger in his chest. And I said, don't quit. You may feel like a shopping cart with a stuck wheel. You know what I'm talking about? You know the way you want to go, but you keep getting pulled off track. Don't you ever give up getting back on track. God in heaven loves us so deeply that repeatedly, again and again and again, He calls us to get back on track. It's called living by faith. And if your life feels at times like you're stuck in a rut, your knowledge has outpaced your obedience, there's no point, or you feel like a failure, the next 4 weeks are for you. Because the great hero of the faith, Abraham, if I could be like Abraham. You know what we're going to find with Abraham? His life was in a rut. And he failed again and again. We're going to find that even though he knew the right thing to do, there were times he did the wrong thing. We're going to discover at the end of the day, God pursued him, chased him down, and brought him back again and again and again with this promise. Listen, with this promise. I will bless you. I will bless you. We're going to see it next week in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. I'll bless you. Listen, I'll bless you so that you can be a blessing to others. That's the best life. In fact, listen to it. Here's the theme of our series, Still Meant for More, over the next 5 weeks. Introduction today, 4 weeks in the life of Abraham. Listen. Living by faith is the most thrilling and fulfilling choice you will ever make. And I chose those modifiers on purpose. Thrilling. Because if you think life is bored, you're not living by faith. God called Abraham to do some of the most outrageous things you can imagine. Leave everything you know and move to a new place, and I will bless you. Trust me, God said, for what you cannot see right now. In his case, children and grandchildren and grandgrandchildren. It's thrilling. Living by faith will be the most thrilling and fulfilling thing you will ever do. Some of you, God stirred in your heart this thing, and life has sort of weighed you down. We're going to discover how to live by faith in a way that brings such fullness and joy and fulfilling. So that when you look back on the net output of your life, you're like, that was so worth it. At times it was white-knuckled scary, but it was worth it. Thrilling and fulfilling. Living by faith is the most thrilling and fulfilling choice you will ever make. In fact, Hebrews chapter 11, let me turn you there just for a minute. I realize the time is running on. I'm going to wrap it up quickly. In fact, Pastor Ryan, let's not do a closing song. I'll send him out with a blessing, but Hebrews 11, let's touch on the issue of faith, and then we'll get into the biography of Abraham and how he lived out that faith. We'll do that next Sunday, all right? Is that a deal? Or do you want to stay a lot longer? Oh, don't say that out loud because you're all going to say no. And so, Hebrews 11, verse 1, are you there? Okay, good. Hebrews 11, 1. Now, faith, it's always good to be able to get a definition, right? It's something we're going to study for the next 4 weeks. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So faith is two things. So we're talking about living by faith. What is that going to mean? Number one, it's an assurance. It's a confidence of things hoped for. It looks to the future. Abraham hoped for certain things, and he had a conviction, an assurance, yeah, I can trust this. Living by faith is always future focused, and there is a reality that we hold on to about that future because God's promised to bless. If you are a parent or a grandparent living by faith, it's the only way. Second, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. Here it is, the conviction of things not seen. I love that sense of conviction. It's reaching out towards what's unseen. And God is calling some of you. We'll hear next week. We'll learn next week about how to hear God's voice and that sense of calling. God is calling you in some ways. You say, I just can't see how it's going to work out. You're in the perfect spot then. Because what faith does is help you grasp what is unseen. It's the assurance of the future, things hoped for. It's the conviction, the grasping onto what I cannot even see. In fact, verse 2, by it, that is by faith, the people of old, that's Old Testament saints, received their commendation. God spoke well of them. Let me give you a working definition of faith that we're going to use over the next 4 weeks. Faith is believing, choosing, and acting as though God really keeps his promises. I make choices, I believe, I choose, and I act as though God really keeps his promises. Now, all throughout here, we're going to see by faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith. It's by faith plus an action step. All right, so look at chapter 11. Well, look at verse 6. Pastor Ryan shared this during the song. Hebrews 11:6 is going to be projected for you. And without faith, it is, what's the word? Okay, and without faith, it is, what's the word? To please God. That's pretty direct. Doesn't need a lot of exposition. We choose to live by faith. God is pleased with us in that way. And so Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, by faith, there it is, and here's a step, Abraham obeyed. He called to go to a new place, and he went. By faith, verse 9, he went to live in the land. Verse 11, by faith, Sarah, that is his wife, received power to conceive. Now look at the end of verse 11. She, that is Sarah, considered him, that is God, faithful, who had promised. That's good. She trusted God's character. And then look at verse 19. He, that is Abraham, considered that God was able. So Sarah considered God to be faithful. Her husband Abraham considered God to be able. So good. So let's do this. How can I begin living by faith? Let's just wrap up. We'll land the plane on this message. And we'll pick it up next week with introducing Abraham's biography from Genesis 12. How can I begin living by faith? Okay, Scott, you sold me. It sounds like, yeah, rediscovering that faith I had as a young person or stretching out in ways that I haven't even considered in a while. That's going to be the most thrilling and fulfilling thing I'm going to do. How do I do it? What are first steps? Great question. Glad you asked. How can I begin living by faith? First of all, choose to trust God's character and care. God's character. Sarah, Abraham's wife, he who promised is faithful. That's true. If I'm going to live by faith, it's going to be found on the bedrock of I can trust God, his character. We'll see that over and over again. And his care. Abraham said, God demanded the most of me, but I trust, even if it took a miracle, he's for my good. God is for my good. That is so life-giving. If I'm going to live by faith, I choose to trust God's character and his care. In fact, Psalm 62, just one of my favorite verses. Put that up. Listen. It's just so good. One thing God has spoken. Two things I've heard. That you, O God, are, say it with me, you're strong. I can trust you. And that you, O Lord, are, say it with me. Yeah. That's faith. God's character and his care. He's strong and he's loving. Choose to live that way, to believe that. Second, how can I begin living by faith? Choose to trust God's character and care. Second, choose to hear and obey God's call. We don't just hear it, feel that stirring that God is asking me to take this step of faith, to move out of my comfort zone, to make a decision or take an action that's going to impact a generation or two from now. Choose to hear, but also obey God's call. Let me say a word about hearing God's call. Again, more of it next week. God's call is connected to a promise. God calls you to do something, he's going to connect that to a promise. We'll see that out of the scriptures. Second, how do I hear and obey God's call? God's call is often heard in a crisis. Abraham received that call to leave what he knew to go to a new place and build a new future when his father died, Terah. In that moment of crisis, like, wow, what's the future look like now? God said, it's going to look different than you thought. 3, how do I choose to hear and obey God's voice? His voice is connected to a promise, or his call is connected to a promise. It's heard in a crisis, and it requires a faith decision. We're going to have to choose to respond to that. So, how can I begin living by faith? I choose to trust God's character and care. I choose to hear and obey God's voice. 3, I choose to enjoy God's blessing. Choose to enjoy God's blessing. When I think of my own life, kind of the narrative arc of our story. Vicky and I grew up in northern Indiana. We had our family there. My mom attended our church. Her mom and dad lived there. And in 1996, we moved to Chicago. Among the reasons we moved was because we just felt like God had a future for us here. And there were some tough days. Honestly, my mother died, and on a Friday, the 14th of January, I buried her. On Sunday, the 16th of January, I preached my first message in Chicago. That was a lot. And I would not trade what the last 28 years have been in my life and generationally in the lives of my children and grandchildren. Simply would not have the blessings we have now if we had not chosen to live in faith. For the next 4 weeks, you're going to hear it over and over and over and over and over again. We choose to take God at his word. We choose to live by faith. God will bless that. It may not be obvious for years. It may be the next generation or the one after that is going to reap the blessing, as we saw in Abraham, or we'll see in Abraham's case. But if your faith is a little bored, you're beginning to doubt that faith, it's leaning in more than ever before that will reignite a bored faith. It is the most thrilling and fulfilling choice you will ever make. Join us the next few weeks as we kind of explore deeply what it is to live a life of faith, not only for us personally, but corporately. What does that mean for the life of our church? It's going to mean not staying exactly where we are, but taking those steps of faith that we believe God will bless. So, all right, let me do this. Let me pray over us. After that, I'm going to say a blessing over you, and we'll wrap our service today. Father, man, what a good service today. Dedicating children, hearing an update on what you've already done in just the first year of what's happening with Men for More. Lord, that just gets me so fired up about the future. Lord, your people have been so good, so generous, so faithful till now. Will you help us, Lord, in new, fresh ways to experience your calling and your blessing? Father, for those here today that can identify with Drew, who had felt far away, or others I've talked to in recent days who feel like this has been a hard season, we help them, Lord, as they choose to live out faith, to begin to sense the thrill and the fulfillment of you keeping your word and blessing. Lord, that's our choice as a congregation. Will you, as you promised, will you bless that decision? Now and in the future, I pray. We ask this in Jesus' strong name. All God's people agreed by saying,